Installing lift kit on a Jeep JT Gladiator is exactly the same as installing one on a Jeep JL Wrangler, or at least when it comes to the front end. In fact, we have a detailed video that'll show you how to do just that, and you can see it now by clicking on the link in the description below. Of course, a Gladiator is a pickup truck, and so there are differences on the rear, subtle as they might be, and that's what I'll be covering in this video. As always, this is something that you want to be doing on a level surface. And as is the case with the JL Wrangler, when you're working on the rear end, you want to make sure that your four-wheel drive is engaged, that you chock your front wheels, and that you raise your Jeep and set the frame rails back down on a set of jack stands. And for my purposes, I do have a lift, and so I will be using it. However, I'm purposely setting it to about the same height as my jack stands would be, just to show you that it can be done with a set of them. With that said, the very first thing I'm going to be doing is removing the rear tires, and for that I'll need a 22mm socket. Before I remove anything else, I'm going to use a floor jack to support the weight of the axle from the bottom of the differential. Alright, now using a 21mm socket, I'm going to remove the bolt securing the track bar to the axle. Alright, the sway bar links can now come off, and for that, I'll be using an 18mm gear wrench and a 6mm Allen wrench to hold the stud in place, and then I can remove it from the sway bar. And then, using an 18mm socket, I can now remove the bolt securing it to the frame. Now for the other side. Next up are the shocks, and for that, I'll be using a 21mm socket and wrench to remove them. And I should note, it is helpful to have a swivel for this. Alright, before I go any further and remove anything else, I'm going to go ahead and look for anything that might get hung up or pulled out when I lower the axle, or even when the axle's at a full droop. And that includes things like the locker wiring harness. As you can see here, I'm going to use a small screwdriver to unlock it and then squeeze down on it, pull it out. And because I know this is going to hang up as well, I'm going to pull it off that stud. And maybe off this emergency brake cable. And then, because I know that the breather hose will probably pull out, I'm going to go ahead and separate it from the tub. Free that up, and that should be good enough for the trail as well. And then there's the brakes. Looking at the hose, it looks pretty short and like it could be a problem. But the speed sensor, it looks like there's enough slack in it, so I'm going to go ahead and disconnect it from all these clips. I think there's enough there. And then, using an 18mm socket, I'm going to remove the caliper and hang it from the frame just to make sure there isn't going to be an issue. Always a good idea to hang your calipers. You never want them hanging from the hose. good time as any to talk about what lift kit we'll be installing on our Jeep JT Gladiator. And that is an EVO Enforcer Stage 3 Overland Kit. As you can see, we've already got it installed up front. And we're just focusing on the rear because I haven't done an install video for that yet. This right here are all the components that are going to go on the rear, which include taller springs, adjustable upper control arms, sway bar links, heavy duty adjustable track bar. In this case, we opted to get the Bilstein shocks. It also comes with a track bar relocation bracket, bump stop extensions, all the hardware that you need, and spacers for the carrier bearing, because this kit is designed to yield 4.5 inches of lift. And that's what I'm going to install now. All right, using a 16mm socket and an extension, I'm going to go ahead and remove the 2 bolts securing the carrier bearing to the frame. As you can see, EVO provides longer bolts with their spacer kit. And before I install anything, I'm going to apply a little bit of red Loctite to the threads. And then I'm going to take my torque wrench and set it to 46 foot-pounds of torque. Okay, for these new bolts, we're going to take out the 16mm socket and replace it with a 15. And last but not least, I'm going to loosen up all the control arm bolts because the control arms have cleveite bushings or bonded rubber bushings, and they're just going to offer up way too much bind to allow the axle to fully droop out. So for that, I'll be using a 21mm socket and a 24mm wrench. You could totally see the axle shift with each bolt that I loosened up. And I should note that this would have been a necessary step anyway, especially if you're retaining the factory control arms, because once you're lifted, all those bushings would be in a state of bind, and you'd want to release that and re-torque all those bolts with the full weight of the vehicle on the ground. Now we can lower the axle and remove the coils. Carefully let it down. Try to keep your eye on everything else to make sure nothing is getting hung up that we might have missed. There you can see the coils falling out right now. I'm going to stop. This one's totally falling out. Those two. All right. As you can see, I just placed the axle on a pair of jack stands because now I'm going to replace the upper control arms. Once again, we're going to be using our 21mm socket and 24mm wrench to remove the bolts securing the driver's side control arm. And before I remove the passenger side upper control arm, I'm going to support the pinion with my floor jack. According to EVO, these control arms should be set as a starting point to 16 5/8 of an inch. And as you can see here, they're actually set to about 16 9/16, which means I need to adjust it out a little bit. There, that looks like about 16 5/8. So just this, jamming it down. Yep, same deal. About 16 5/8. And I should note that both the Zerk nipples should be pointing in the same direction. And just to make sure that there's grease in them, I'm going to give it a couple squirts just to make sure. All right, now we can put things together, making sure that the Zerks are pointing up. As you can see, the bolt holes aren't exactly lining up, front or rear, by quite a bit. So now I'm going to take the floor jack and raise the pinion up just a little bit to help make that possible. All right, so I'm just loosely putting on the nuts so that we can make sure we have enough wiggle room to get the passenger side upper control arm on. Once again, making sure that your Zerk nipples are pointing upward. Again, this is just a starting point. Ultimately, when the full weight of the vehicle is on the ground, I'm going to want to readjust these control arms so that the pinion is sitting in line with the rear drive shaft. So now I'm just going to snug up these bolts just to make sure everything stays in place. All right, now we can install our new coils. But before I can do that, I need to address this thing. This thing is the upper spring perch isolator, and as you can see, it's got a nipple on it that needs to go through a hole on the top of the perch. The problem is, there's nothing to hold the isolator in place, and you can see it just falls right out. This is a problem that a lot of guys struggle with, but I've got a pro tip for you. This is spray adhesive, and there are multiple manufacturers of it. This is made by Loctite, but 3M makes something called Super 77 spray mount, and that's what I'm going to use to hold these guys in place. All you need to do is shake it up and spray some on, and then apply some to the upper spring perch. After you let them set up for about a minute, you can just press them into place. That's all you need to do. Now for the other side. All right, now we can pull out the jack stands and carefully lower the axle back down. Now we can install the coils. So I should point out that at least with an EVO kit, all their coils are corner specific, and you can see this is ending in 166 and this is 167. This one is the driver's side coil and this is the passenger. So let me grab these guys. This is here. Let's see if I have enough droop here to get this coil in. Now, it is important to note, and if you look up here, the upper spring perch isolators, they are indexed. So where this point terminates, it needs to terminate on the same point on the isolator. All right, now I'm going to apply a little pressure with the axle, make sure everything's seated in place. Double check to make sure that everything terminates on the isolator like it should. Perfect. Now I'm going to put it back on jack stands just so that I have more room to work with. Because this EVO kit does come with the new heavy-duty adjustable track bar, I'm going to go ahead and remove the factory one now, and for that I'll be needing a 21mm socket and wrench. In addition to a new heavy-duty adjustable track bar, the EVO kit also comes with a rear track bar relocation bracket. This helps to correct track bar geometry and provide better stability, and I'm going to start the process of installing it now. Okay, you'll notice here that there is a notch in the back of the bracket, and we're going to go ahead and slide this into the factory mount. There, so it just sits on top of it. And as you can see here, it's also cradled on top of the axle and will ultimately be held in place with this U-bolt. Now, before we can bolt this on, there is this one hole that'll need to be drilled. And so I'm gonna go ahead and locate it now by first taking this crush sleeve, and we're going to take the hardware provided, slip this up into place. Thread that in. Take this washer, place it on, nut as well. And then using a 7/8 inch wrench to hold it in place and a 13/16 inch socket, we're gonna just zip this thing in. And then using a center punch, I'm going to mark the point where I need to drill that hole. Take this thing back apart. Okay, now I'm going to use a 3/8 inch drill bit to drill a hole through the factory track bar mount, or in my case, a unibit, because I find that it's easier to cut through steel. And of course, a little bit of cutting oil will help make that easier as well. First and foremost, some eye protection. Put a little bit of cutting oil on. Okay, since I just drilled a hole through metal and I don't want it to rust, I'm going to take some brake clean and just kind of clean that out. Make sure there's no cutting oil in there. Of course, brake clean dries super fast. And then I'm going to use some chassis paint, flame paint. Just hit that hole up a bit. Dries pretty quick, and I'm sure it's going to be fine. I'm going to go ahead and install this bracket again. All right, we're going to go ahead and reinstall crush sleeve, bolt, All right, then I'm gonna go ahead and zip it on just a bit. Take the provided hardware, slip it through, take a washer and stover, attach it on the back side. Okay, just kind of loose for now. And then we're gonna take our U-bolt, couple these smaller washers and stovers. These washers on. All right, just need to tighten everything up now. Again, with the 7/8 inch wrench and 13/16 inch socket. Now I'm gonna use a 9/16 inch socket and wrench to get this little guy on. And then the U-bolt also requires a 9/16 inch socket. Just want to do this evenly. Just need to grab a torque wrench and get everything tightened to torque spec. Okay, so for this big bolt here, we're going to set it to 130 foot-pounds of torque. Okay. And then these smaller bolts, we're going to set those to 35 foot-pounds of torque. Okay, time for the bump stop extensions. Got these guys, all the hardware for it. And then if you look here on the bump stop pads on the axle, there are only 2 holes here. We're going to take our bump stop so that it's leaning forward, place it on top, take the provided hardware with washer on it, slip it through the hole, do the same right here. And then we're going to take a couple of the stovers and washers, put them underneath. All right, now using a 1/2 inch wrench, and if you don't have 2 of them, a 13 millimeter wrench will work as well. We can go ahead and secure these bolts in place. Okay. Okay. All right, time to get the shocks installed. And unlike the front set, which you can see here are installed can side down, the rears are going to be installed can side up. And you can tell because the word Bilstein is actually legible in this direction, and they come with shock boots. And the shock boots are actually to help protect the shock shaft from stones and things like that getting kicked back and hitting them. All right, so I'm going to take my bolt. Nut. And we're going to go ahead and cut the strap. All right, looks like we're a little bit short. I'm going to need to raise the axle. Let's give that a look. That might do it. Perfect. All right, just like before, I'm gonna use a 21 millimeter socket with a swivel and a 21 millimeter wrench, and we'll secure these bolts in place. These are going to need to be tightened to 100 foot-pounds of torque. So for those of you who are installing a lift that's going to yield about 4 inches of height or less, you can go ahead and reinstall your brake calipers now. However, as I mentioned before, this kit that EVO makes is going to give us 4.5 inches of lift, and there's tons of droop. And when I put my brake caliper up, even with the hose fully taut, I'm still just shy of reaching the holes to mount it back onto the axle. And even if I could force it on, I wouldn't want to. Articulated, this thing will rip right out, and that's a real problem. But fortunately, EVO does provide a set of stainless steel extended brake lines with their kit, and that's what I'm going to be installing now. All right, the first thing I'm going to do is open up the hood on my Jeep. And then I'm going to open up the master cylinder just a bit, but kind of leave the cap on because we're probably going to need to refill this. Then I'm going to take a oil catch pan and place it underneath the area that I'm going to be working on because brake fluid is going to be dripping out and I don't want to make a mess. And then from there, I'm going to be preemptive and take the caliper bolts and apply a little bit of red Loctite to them. I know there are guys out there who are deathly afraid of red Loctite, but in the over 25 years that I've been working on Jeeps, I've never had an issue removing a bolt with red Loctite. And for those of you who know, when the Gladiator first came out, one of the first TSBs that was issued was in regards to rear caliper bolts coming out. That is not something I want. So I'll set these aside. I'm gonna make sure the caliper is out of the way. And then I'm gonna take a pair of pliers, pull out this retaining clip. Okay, now take a 12mm wrench and a 16mm wrench, and I'll use the 16 to hold the soft line while I use the 12mm to separate the hard line from it. Now I can take the whole caliper and place it back onto the axle, and I'll thread in these bolts to hold it in place. Okay. Using an 18mm socket, I'm going to zip that in. And then I'm going to set my torque wrench to 92 foot-pounds of torque and secure those bolts in place. Perfect. From here, I'm going to be using a 15mm socket to separate the banjo bolt from the caliper. Now this banjo bolt's going to be reused. We can discard those copper crush washers and install a pair of new ones. Slip it through the angled end of the brake line. And I'll go ahead and thread that in. You want to make sure that the elbow is pointing out and up, just like factory. And then we can connect the soft end to the hard line, just like that. We attach the retaining clip. And then this time around, we'll use the same 12mm wrench for the hard line, but we will need a 19mm wrench for the soft line. Hold that in place, and we can tighten this on. Okay. And then finally, taking our 15mm socket, we're going to tighten up the banjo bolt to 23 foot-pounds of torque. It's not a whole lot. You need to be careful not to overcrush them. Okay, there we go. All right, from here we can take our speed sensor, reattach it to the mount on the frame, and then take some zip ties and secure it to the brake line. Perfect. On to the other side. All right, I tried to move really quickly so I wouldn't lose too much fluid, and it looks like I did a pretty good job. Here's the max line up here, and you can see the fluid's just right there. So I'm just gonna add a little bit more because I will need to bleed the brakes. All right, looks good. On to the sway bar links. All right, so these will need to be assembled. And to do that, I'll be using a little bit of WD-40 on these bushings. Placing it into the eye of the sway bar link, and then using a bench vise to press it in. There. Then I'm going to take one of these bushings, same deal, get it started, press it in, just like that. So at the frame mount, we're just going to go ahead and recycle the factory hardware. Slip it through, thread it in, rotate up the sway bar so that it's in line. Take the bolt, put a washer on, slip it through, another washer, and put on a nut. All right, so using an 18mm socket, I'm going to go ahead and secure this bolt in place. And then tighten it to 55 foot-pounds of torque. Now using a 19mm socket and wrench, we can secure the sway bar link to the sway bar. And again, tighten to the same 55 foot-pounds of torque. Last but not least, the track bar. Last component that gets installed. And because we have a track bar relocation bracket, I should be able to get by just setting this to about the factory length, which I'm getting 33 3/4. So right now I have 33 and like 5/16. Let's take this, take it out. $33 5/8, getting close. $33 3/4. Okay. All right, before I install this on our Jeep, you can see these bolts are a little bit loose, so I'm going to use a 15mm wrench and a 15mm socket just to snug them in. Let's take this over. Now I should note that these are just the starting point for this track bar. We may ultimately need to adjust it more to give our axle a more centered appearance at ride height. But for now, this will be good enough to get going. Just gonna use the factory hardware here. Coming up on top. Because this track bar uses a spherical joint at the frame mount, I can go ahead and secure it in place now. And for that, I'll be using my 21mm socket and wrench. And I can go ahead and tighten that to 120 foot-pounds of torque. And before I forget, I'm going to go ahead and re-plug in our locker wiring harness, lock it in place, and then I'm going to actually reattach it to the stud just to help protect that plug from getting pulled out. But I am going to reach up here and pry it away from the frame just to give it more slack. All right, moment of truth. We can finally get our new wheels and tires installed. As you can see, these are Nitto Trail Grapplers in a 37-1250, and they're mounted on KMC tank beadlock wheels in an anthracite and black green. So we're gonna get these on just to do some final adjustments and torque all the control arms that we can, and then we should be ready to go. One thing actually, I did buy some new lug nuts that are actually a lot taller than factory, because once they get into these wheels, they can get actually pretty hard to get in there, especially with the 22mm socket that's necessary. These are in fact 3/4 of an inch or 19mm, so it'll be a lot easier. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That guy out. 19. Time to put this thing back on its own feet. That looks great. Wow, looks almost as tall as our big Gladiator on 42s. Holy cow. All right, now we can start wrapping up the rear end, and the first thing I'm gonna do is secure the track bar to the rear axle. All right, since we installed this track bar relocation bracket, you can see the track bar is actually lined up pretty well. So I'm gonna use the factory hardware, the bolt and flag nut, and using a 21mm wrench and socket, I'm gonna secure it in place. And then we're gonna tighten this bolt to 120 foot-pounds of torque. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to use my floor jack and raise the rear end of this truck from the axle. And then I'll set it back down on jack stands. Now I'll be using my 19mm socket and remove my tires again. With the jack stands effectively acting as our tires, I can now work on all the control arms with the full weight of this Jeep on the ground. All right, now it's time to adjust the pinion angle. And as you can see, the drive shaft and the pinion are not in line with each other. In fact, I put my angle finder on the pinion. As you can see here, the pinion's sitting at about 3 to 4 degrees. And the drive shaft is sitting at maybe like 9 or 10 degrees. So that's what we're going to correct now and make sure that it is in line with each other. Now, I should note that normally a pinion adjustment isn't necessary, especially on something like a Jeep JL Wrangler or a factory drive shaft, being that they have Arzeppa or Zephyr joints. But because this is a Gladiator and has this crazy weird geometry on the control arms that causes the pinion to dip down even more at a full droop, we're going to line that pinion up with the drive shaft just so that there's a bit more wiggle room when you're off-roading. All right, now I'm going to take my floor jack and use it to support the pinion. Now using my 21mm socket and 24mm wrench, I'm going to go ahead and remove the bolts securing the upper control arm to the axle. Okay, now I'm going to use my floor jack to raise up the pinion, at least till where it looks about right, and then I'm going to double check it with my angle finder. So that looks like about 8 degrees, and that looks like about 8 degrees as well. I think I'm on. So from here, just going to loosen up this jam nut and then rotate out my control arm until it meets up with the holes. All right, let's get the other side on as well before we tighten anything up. That looks like it might be right. Okay, now we're talking. All right, now we can tighten up all the control arm bolts. And the upper arms, because they have Johnny joints, those will need to be 120 foot-pounds of torque. But the lower arms, because we're keeping the factory arms and they have cleavite or bonded rubber bushings, those will actually need to be 190 foot-pounds of torque. You here to help? You want to torque all the bolts on? Do you want to torque all the bolts on for me? That'd be nice. All right, so the shock is clearly in the way for this last bolt on the lower control arm, so I'm going to go ahead and disconnect it from the axle so I can get better leverage on this last bolt. Whew, that's a lot of force. Fortunately, The bolts were pinching in well enough that I didn't actually have to hang on to the wrench at the same time. And using a much bigger torque wrench with a lot more leverage, I was able to get that last bolt on. Holy cow. All right, now I need to tighten up the jam nuts to 150 foot-pounds of torque. And for that, I'll be using one of these, a crow's foot. All right, just need to get the shocks back on, wheels and tires, and there are just a few more things that need to be done before we're ready to go. All right, just need to set my torque wrench to 130 foot-pounds of torque, and there's one more thing that I still need to do, and that's to bleed the brakes. So, bleeding the brakes on a Jeep JT Gladiator is super easy to do, especially on one that's been lifted. And this is something that you can totally do by yourself. All you're gonna need is some brake fluid, a jar like this. This is a mason jar or some kind of water bottle even. Nylon hose with a 1/4 inch interior diameter, and of course, a 10mm wrench. Now, earlier I did top off the master cylinder, which is something that you should do, especially after you changed out brake lines. And then you always want to work on the brake caliper that's furthest away from it. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and remove the nipple protecting the bleeder valve. And then I'm going to connect the nylon hose to it and then place it into this mason jar. And then you're going to take some brake fluid, pour it in the jar just a bit so that no air gets sucked back into it, into the line that is. And then we're going to take our 10mm wrench onto the bleeder valve and just crack it open just a little bit. Okay, in fact, I'll leave the wrench there for good keeping. Now we can go into the Jeep. All right, from here you're just going to want to step on the brake pedal a good 3 to 4 times slowly all the way to the floor. It's 1, 2, 3. I can feel it firming up. 4. Okay, let's go check it. All right, looks like there's fluid coming down the hose now, a little bit more bubbles. I'm going to give it a few more pushes, and then I think we're going to be done with the passenger side. Okay, the passenger side is done, and before we move on to the driver's side, I'm going to add a bit more fluid to the master cylinder, just to make sure there's enough in there. Okay, now we can go ahead and close the bleeder valve. Remove our wrench and hose, plug it back up, and move over to the driver's side. Just need to top off the master cylinder one more time. All right, I think we're done. Obviously, there are a few more things that still need to be done to finish up this install, or at least up front anyway. And Those would include things like tightening up bolts to their proper torque spec now that the full weight of the vehicle is on the ground, and recentering your steering wheel. Of course, we cover all that in our JL Wrangler install video, and again, that can be seen by clicking on the link in the description below. Oh, and for those of you who are wondering about the geometry correction brackets that do come with this particular EVO lift, well, that's something I'll be covering in a future video. So be sure to check back for that. For now, here's what everything looks like when all is said and done. I hope you found this video to be useful. And if you're not already a member, we would love for you to join us on our online community at wayalife.com. Until next time, keep the shiny side up, all four on the floor, and with any luck, we'll see you on the trail.